Hey again, everybody. I hope these videos are helping move your brain in the right direction when it comes to fully engaging the question for paper one. As you know, you're supposed to write a paper that takes a stand on whether working class Americans, like our good friend in Upton Sinclair's book, Jurgis, are those people really free? Do we really consider them to be free and equal to kind of pursue happiness in a legitimate way? And if you joined us in the previous episode, the previous installment of this series, you found out that these working conditions were anything but safe. They were very, very dangerous, and worse, these accidents that were almost inevitable in happening, they weren't the responsibility of the employers. Employers throughout the late 19th century had virtually no responsibility whatsoever to create a safe and decent working environment. Oftentimes, as we found out with our example, oftentimes these accidents led to unemployment, which led to poverty and naturally inequality. So that's sort of a strike one. At least in my estimation, it's a strike one when it comes to, are workers like Jurgis, are they really free? Okay. So working conditions and the point of production, that's a very vivid example in terms of something that you might be able to use as a piece of evidence for paper one. Now, I want to reiterate something before we get rolling here. I want to reiterate this idea that if this is me writing the paper, I would use the 5-paragraph essay approach to writing it. You got your intro, you got your conclusion, and then you got your 3 body paragraphs. Now, as far as I'm concerned, again, this is strictly an opinion. If it doesn't work for you, then no big deal whatsoever. But I might use hazardous working conditions as paragraph 1. You got one of these video installments under your belt. Use working environment, hazardous working conditions as paragraph 1. And what we might be able to work on right here today, everybody, would be paragraph 2. Okay? So here's what I want you to do if you haven't done so already. Grab your copy of The Jungle. I've got mine right here next to me. If you're old-fashioned and you've got a paper copy of the book, go get it. And what you're going to want to do is open it up to chapter 22. Now, if you're using the free edition, the one that I gave you in Canvas, go ahead and download that. And then I want you to scroll down to chapter 22. It's the very beginning of chapter 22, which if you're using the one online, that is the top left corner of page 228. So 228 will do what you need it to do. Go to that page, and you'll be able to follow along with me. So, like anything else, I need to do a little bit of stage setting before this is really going to make any sense. I think that you can also make a very vivid, very strong case that the neighborhoods in which workers called home, the areas in which workers lived, were also very problematic when it comes to really driving at a free and equal society. They were very dangerous places to live. So if you're doing the math, workers are working in dangerous jobs, and they're also living in dangerous environments, dangerous conditions. Okay? What I'd like you to do is for this to really make some sense, you're going to have a little bit of context. If you go back to the point where Jurgis breaks his ankle, he's thrown out of work and he's staying home a lot of the day. I mean, he's looking for work, but he's not really able to find any jobs, and he's home a lot. And one of the things that the family has him do, because pretty much everybody in that household works, they have him watch his son, Antanas. Antanas is like a year and a half old, and he's a kid that's into everything. He's a chatterbox, but Jurgis doesn't really mind it very much. In other words, he's got a very close personal connection to his son. Now, on this one particular occasion, Jurgis goes out. He had a habit of buying the newspaper, and he went out to buy the family a newspaper, and he left his son, Antanas, unattended for a specified amount of time. You can kind of see where this one is headed. Well, Antanas, turns out, left the apartment, and was roaming the streets of Chicago. And this wasn't really all that out of the ordinary. There were thousands of children that did this every day. We are talking about a long, long time before the era of compulsory schooling was required in American life. So there essentially isn't anybody that's watching the young ones while their parents are away or at work. Anyway, what I want you to do is open up to page 22, and you're gonna be met with some tragedy here. Jurgis's little boy is gonna die, and it's gonna be the primary responsibility of the city. It doesn't have a safe living environment. Okay, so let's take a look at this. The very beginning of chapter 22. In my book, this is page 192. It does not matter which edition of The Jungle you're using. It's the same thing. The beginning of chapter 22. Jurgis took the news in peculiar way. He turned deadly pale, but he caught himself, and for half a minute he stood in the middle of the room. He's reacting to the news of his son's death. Clutching his hands tightly and setting his teeth, and then he pushed Pani and Nellie aside and strode into the next room, and he climbed the ladder. In the corner was a blanket with the form half showing beneath it, and beside it lay Elizabetta, whether crying or in faint, Jurgis could not tell. Maria was pacing the room, screaming and wringing her hands. He clenched his hands tighter, and his voice was hard as he spoke. "How did it happen?" he asked. Maria scarcely heard him in her agony. He repeated the question, louder yet more harshly. "He fell off of the sidewalk," she wailed. The sidewalk in front of the house was a platform made of half-rotten boards, about 3 feet above the level of the sunken street. "How did he come to be there?" Jurgis demanded. He went out to play," Maria sobbed, her voice choking her. "We couldn't make him stay in. He must have gotten caught in the mud." "Are you sure he's dead?" he demanded. Aye, she wailed. "Yes, we had the doctor." So let's dig into this. In a way, this is par for the course for some of the themes, issues, and concepts that we've been talking about for more than a week now, okay? The cities were dangerous places to live, dangerous places to be almost, and in particular, Chicago. Now, the book mentions something, and unless you're from Chicago or you've studied the history of Chicago, it probably wouldn't have resonated with you. Before Chicago got the name, the Windy City, it was known as Mud City, USA. Being on the lake as it was, when you'd get heavy rains, the city would flood. It would basically become sort of a muddy, nasty mess of a place. And basically people began referring to it as it was on its upswing, as it was up and coming. People began to call it Mud City, USA. So, it wasn't out of the ordinary for Chicago to flood very often. We'll come back to that point in a second. The other issue that you might not have noticed upon the first glance is the fact that those wooden boards, those rotten wooden boards that the author referenced there. Chicago was literally made out of wood. And in addition to being a combustible material, meaning that if you don't have building codes that space out the buildings, then virtually all of Chicago is going to burn to the ground, starting with one building, which is essentially what happened in the 1870s and the Great Chicago Fire. Again, a very dangerous place to live. The other problem with wood is that it does, as the jungle noted, it absorbs the water. And it holds in bacteria. It holds in things that could breed illnesses, disease, sickness. And so this can be hazardous to your health as well. But let's talk about the case involving Jurgis' son. The bottom line is, when it rains hard out where we are today, we've got a storm sewer system. We've got a process whereby the standing water, which can get quite high in the streets, It's drained and it goes somewhere else. It's safely drained so that drivers and pedestrians can get to where they're going safely. For the most part, it's safe. But this also involves city codes, municipal ordinances that say, this is safe for people to live here. This is safe for people to pursue recreation wherever it is that they're pursuing recreation. A case that I always like to use, or an example that I always like to use in class, is the amount of people that each one of our rooms on campus is licensed for. Even though the institution might want to bring more people in to get more bang for its buck, it can't, because we have these fire codes, okay? You can't bring just as many people as you can stuff into a room. We're breaking the law, and if the fire department caught us, we would get shut down. Those laws, those codes, those ordinances, they don't exist in the Gilded Age. And so when it comes to storm sewers, you would have standing water in Chicago on an everyday basis. If you stepped in just the wrong place, you might drown in, I hesitate to use the word mud puddle, but to keep it as PG-13 as possible, you could drown in a mud puddle. It was a dangerous place to be. It was an especially dangerous place if you happen to be a child. There were no codes. There were no mechanisms to make this very dangerous place a little bit safer. Now, I'm not picking on Chicago, and again, one of the things that you're tasked with as far as this assignment is to bring in evidence from other sources, not outside of our class sources, but I'm talking about the American YOP, your document reader, and I'm talking about my lecture. So I'm going to give you two vivid examples, one from each that we'll get into here today. The first example that I want to bring to your attention is from it's the third chapter of the YOP. I believe that would be chapter 18. It's entitled Living in the Industrial City. There's a Danish, he's from Denmark, so a Danish journalist by the name of Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S, Jacob Riis, and he wrote this really famous piece entitled How the Other Half Lives. And in it, he describes life in New York City's dumbbell tenements, okay? They were called the dumbbell tenements because they were shaped like a weight, like something that you'd see in a gym, so the name just kind of stuck, the dumbbell tenements. Anyway, inside these dumbbell tenements, he notes that there, in certain rooms, in certain areas of the apartment complex, they don't have any windows. And so if you do have an emergency, it's virtually impossible to get out. You don't have access to escape if there's, something like a fire. Furthermore, a lot of these areas of living, they don't have any ventilation, they don't have any access to sunlight, and so if you're doing the math here, you got a dark, damp environment. It's leaky when it rains, the water settles in there, it's a breeding ground for disease. And so you'd get a mild cold that would come in one end of the dumbbell tenements, and it would sweep through the entire complex. It was also a very dangerous place to live. Now, that all being said, just like my example in the classroom, there's no law that says that you can't cram like 20, 25 people into a one-bedroom apartment. And, this wasn't just the case in places like New York. In Detroit, it was said that, the place that most people dressed was the middle of the bed. There literally wasn't enough elbow room to do it anywhere else, so the only place left for you was to dress on top of the bed. There's no codes to say that this particular apartment is only licensed for a family of 4. Those laws don't exist. And once again, you got to ask yourself, why do those laws not exist? But one more example just for the good of the order, and we're going to bring this one in from lecture. There is a lecture entitled Progressivism that is very, very useful. It's very, very similar to what we're talking about here when it comes to the cities being dangerous places to live and work. I'm talking about the example that we call the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which is going to occur March 1911, okay? Now, the Triangle Company made ladies' clothes, and it was, basically, there's no polite way to say it. It was a sweatshop. It was one of these very informal factories. It had a sewing room. It had it had all kinds of production facilities, but it was located within a building that, shared other production facilities. It was located on the ninth and 10th floor of this building in what is now Greenwich Village, New York, that part of New York City. That particular day in March was a very nice spring day, and New Yorkers were out enjoying the day when they saw smoke coming from that part of the city. And everybody kind of just gathered around to see what all the fuss was about. And that's about the time that they began noticing speeding, for the moment, living bodies that were going splat all along the pavement. What we're talking about here is a fire that broke out in March 1911, and because the company was not really required to do things like provide a reasonable and safe escape route or escape outlet if an emergency ever presented itself, it's going to lead to the death of over 140 people. Most of these people were very, very young. Most would be considered what you and I would call girls, youths, okay? Most were women. Before September 11th, 2001, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was the most deadly industrial accident in the history of the city. I mean, that's a very big statement. And the reason why is the company was allowed to do things like lock the doors. So even if workers wanted to get out, they can't because the doors have been locked. They weren't required to have things like adequate fire escapes or sprinkler systems that would have gotten out in front of some of these emergencies because there are no codes to mandate them. So these are very dangerous living and working environments. The cities are dangerous places to be. And not only is that where workers generally live, it's also where they work because cities were centers of production. So that lecture entitled Immigration, Urbanization, and Industrialization, that'll shed a lot of light on this topic that we're talking about, places that workers live. And of course, the one that I just referenced, progressivism, and you might even go through the next one, the square deal. Those lectures are also very good when it comes to describing the dangers that are involved in living and working in the cities. So once again, guys, I hope that this has been helpful. If you've got a specific question for me, you know how to get a hold of me so that I can elaborate. We're going to have one more of these installments before we wrap things up.